Welcome to the Special Ed Strategist, where your special education questions meet expert answers. I'm your host, Wendy Taylor, a certified educational therapist, special educator, and your go-to special ed strategist. Here to collaborate with families to access special education services, ignite student potential, and erase learning gaps. Together, we'll unlock the services and support your kiddo's needs to thrive. Let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by Learning Essentials and our Cracking the Code to Special Education eligibility course. Empower your advocacy, erase confusion, and unlock the services your kiddo deserves. Learn more at learningessentialsedu.com. Hello and welcome to the Special Ed Strategist podcast. Today we're going to be exploring the brain's role of anxiety and neurodiversity, and I want to welcome our guest. I'm so excited to have you, and I want you just to introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about who you are and kind of where you come from in terms of the brain and anxiety.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here with you, Wendy. My name is Salya Namazi. I'm a neuropsychologist with the Stixrud Group. I'm one of the clinical directors and one of the owners of the practice. Our practice was founded by Bill Stixrud in 1985, and he's still with us as well, that I took over in 2017. So I specialize in diagnosing ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions like autism, as well as anxiety. It's something that actually I see quite a bit. It's one of the most common co-occurring. When I say co-occurring, I mean one of the most common conditions I see in addition to other neurodevelopmental differences like ADHD or autism. So it's a big deal. It's also really treatable. So I'm excited to talk with you all about that today.
Absolutely. And I have to say, and I say this to parents when they're looking to have their kiddo evaluated, what I really appreciate about you, Salya, is you really take the time to kind of figure out the puzzle of the kiddo, and that then helps make my job as a educational therapist easier, because then I can kind of really see where those processing, memory, and attention are impacting the academics, but also helps the parents understand kind of the complexities of their kiddo so that they can better support them. So I just wanted to say that I appreciate that about you.
Thank you for saying that. I also think a big part of what we do is helping the child understand themselves too, which I think is
That's
like the
right.
most critical component of it. I hope I hope I'm doing people justice with all that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's complicated and it's hard, and absolutely, yes, that having the kiddo understand themselves really makes a difference, because then they can really develop their strengths and understand who they are and find their own superpower and the world and their way of which ways they're going in life. So, but before we jump in, I always like to ask my guests, what is one little known fact about you that perhaps has nothing to do with the current role? Maybe it's a hobby or an adventure that you've done somewhere in your past or currently that folks may not know about you.
Ooh, that's a really exciting question. I mean, I feel like there's so many I could share. I'm an avid cook. I love to cook. I love to grow my own herbs and use my own herbs from my garden. I'm really into gardening and flowers and those kinds of things. I'm also really into exercising. So those are not have nothing to do with neuropsychology, but those are things that bring me joy and I think bring my family joy as well.
Absolutely, because they get to eat what you make. So that is always delicious. And I am into very similar things. And I feel like I'm spend a lot on getting the plants, but it brings me so much joy. And I know I could grow from seed, but I haven't gotten there yet, but I will one day. So anyways,
You
let's
can
go ahead
ask
and
me
jump
for
in.
tips, Wendy.
Yes, please, because I know there's a lot. I have a dear cousin, and he and I send each other pictures all the time of what's going on in our gardens. We can loop you in too.
I was going to say, add me to that chain.
Yeah, there you go. So, can you explain the neurobiological basis of anxiety disorders?
Yeah, so there's a lot that really goes into anxiety. First of all, anxiety is the most common condition, especially in younger children. And it's also the most common mental health condition. And there are neuroanatomical biological correlates of this. So there's a part of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is like our fear center. We have one on the left, we have one on the right. And this part of the brain, when this part gets activated, it then signals to another part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and then it initiates this kind of complex process where these hormones are released, and then cortisol is released, and then it sends you into this fight or flight response. Now, There are other parts of the brain that are also really important here. So there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like our systems executor. And that part of the brain is actually one of the last parts of the brain to develop. And what this does is it should, if everything's functioning properly, when your body or when you start to detect like a possible stress response or you're detecting threat, this part, the prefrontal cortex should then kind of signal to the amygdala, like, you're okay, you're safe. So it kind of modulates and calms down that response. Now, in someone with an anxiety condition or an anxiety disorder, this part probably isn't working very well. So the prefrontal cortex isn't really may not be sending the signal well to the amygdala. It's also possible that the amygdala is larger or overactive. So there are a lot of, kind of hypotheses as to why this might occur, but that's a big part of it. And when that isn't working very well, then we can see some pretty significant anxiety manifest.
Let me ask you then, so if the prefrontal cortex is the last to develop, and that usually comes online kind of later, right? In terms
Mm-hmm.
of development, how does that then signal the amygdala? So I'm just kind of thinking of like the executive function and all of that that's taking place, and we're kind of waiting for some of that
Mm-hmm.
prefrontal cortex to also, this has a lot to do, right? To come online. But then if the amygdala is freaking out, how does it get censored if it's not fully developed?
That's a
Just
good question. So when I say it's not fully developed, there's one specific part of the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, that doesn't usually develop into our late 20s. And the other functions, they're not fully developed, but they're still developing. So they should still do their job, reasonably well. But I also think that this could be why we're seeing more anxiety in our neurodivergent children. So, children who are autistic or who may have ADHD, there's some neuroanatomical differences with those conditions as well. So there might be, so we think that maybe their brains are less mature. So that I think that will also put someone at heightened risk for developing anxiety. I mean, an autistic kid, I think it's like twice likely that they're going to develop anxiety versus their non-autistic peers. It's much more likely.
how does that tie in with ADHD and the amygdala?
So with ADHD, so autism and ADHD, they both affect the executive functioning systems. And with attention deficit, we also will see like an attention issue. With autism, it's commonly executive functioning. It can be, it's not always, but it can be executive functioning mediated. So with ADHD, given that the child's brain we think is probably less mature, their prefrontal cortex might not be doing such a good job of mediating that stress response to the amygdala, which could then put them at heightened risk for developing anxiety. There's also a lot of other reasons why, though, an autistic kid or a person with ADHD might be more anxious that has nothing to do with this. I mean, someone with ADHD, presumably they may be struggling to get their work done or meeting expectations, which would make one anxious, right? So that could also fuel it. An autistic person, someone with that kind of brain wiring, is such a beautiful type of brain, in my opinion, but it can make a world like we live in very threatening because it's an unpredictable world with change and it's very social. And someone with an autistic brain may feel stressed with that kind of environment. So there are environmental factors that are really important to consider as well.
So what role does the amygdala play in processing emotional stimuli?
So the amygdala is the fear center of the
Okay.
brain. So what happens, and then there's also a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is our kind of our memory system. And what the hippocampus does is it takes information and it disperses it throughout the cortex. So that's how you encode and you store memories. So just example, someone with Alzheimer's dementia, their hippocampus or hippocampi are probably not working very well because they're not storing or forming new memories. So when the amygdala gets activated, when someone is in a stressful situation and their amygdala gets activated, then the hippocampus actually should be calming down the system too, and calming down the hormonal, like cortisol, increase in cortisol, because the hippocampus then will be saying like this, look at the context here. Maybe the hippocampus is using different memories to kind of remind the person or remind the system that this is not actually unsafe. And then that can also that can help with diminishing that fight or flight response, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I kind
It's
of
very
wanted to,
complicated.
yeah, it
It's
is
very
complicated.
complicated.
It is. And I don't necessarily think it's a one size fits all answer. And that's kind of what you do as testing, is kind of go through everything and then make some recommendations. And I know at the end of our towards the end of our conversation today, I really want to talk about how can teachers support students with anxiety or neurodiversities in the classroom, and understanding the background and the why, I think, is really important as well, to then how do we better support either in the classroom or in our home. So what role do neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, how do they come into play?
Yeah, so serotonin is one of our primary neurotransmitters that's responsible for our mood regulation. And some people, or most people, arguably, with anxiety disorders, may have like a diminished serotonin system somewhere. And that's why we try to use like SSRIs, because it's the serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it's helping that serotonin release and increasing that serotonin level. So if your serotonin is lower, if the amount of serotonin is lower, or if the reuptake is too high, then that could put you at increased risk. And there is some genetic correlates as well. So there is a gene, and it's a very complicated name of a gene, but there is a gene that anxiety disorders are very genetic too, and there is a gene that actually pertains to the serotonin system. So the serotonin system is important. Dopamine is more about reward, and there's some research about the differences with these things. So with dopamine, we may see more of that being affected in like social anxiety because of the rewards and that kind of thing. But in other types of anxiety disorders, we may see more of the serotonergic systems being faulty. So that's why medications can be helpful. Therapy can also be really helpful. I mean, anxiety is very treatable. And the thing about anxiety is that it is a very treatable condition, and if we can get in there early and treat it, then we prevent the likelihood of depression, which is much harder to treat. And there's a huge link.
How do you explain to parents kind of the benefits of either medication or therapy or combination? How do you help parents kind of get their head around kind of what would be the best next step for their kiddo?
That's a big question. It's complex because it
It's
really
complex.
depends. I mean, it's really depends
Yeah.
on the kid and what I think they need. I mean, we know that psychotropic medications like SSRIs can be quite effective. We also know that like mindfulness and meditation, especially transcendental meditation in particular, which is a really amazing, easy treatment, can produce pretty similar results. If a child is severely anxious, the best course of action usually in a situation like that is a combination of pharmacotherapy, so medication, with psychotherapy, like an evidence-based treatment. The complexity to this, though, is that sometimes autistic kids, for example, can look anxious, but it's not really that they're anxious. It's that they might be avoiding, because avoidance is really what you want to address too, which we can talk about, and I'll explain that in a minute. But in an autistic person, they might be avoiding a situation that has a lot of sensory input because their sensory systems are heightened. And that's not anxiety per se. That would be adaptive actually for them and helpful for them to avoid that situation. So understanding the cause of the behavior is really, really critical.
And how do you kind of take what you just said, and how does that then look with, because you brought up avoidance, which got me thinking of just about pathological demand avoidance.
Mhm.
Can you just take a second and explain what that is and kind of how that can be all part of this picture or not at all?
So pathological demand avoidance or persistent drive for autonomy, which is what we like to call it because it's less
Yeah.
pejorative, which, most people say pathological demand avoidance, but, we're trying to say, like, let's call it persistent drive for autonomy just to make it sound less pejorative, which is just how I operate in general in life. So PDA is a condition that affects a subset of autistic people. And, in order to be truly PDA, you've got to be autistic. So that's number one. And kids or people with this presentation or this profile, the idea is that a person with these characteristics have a strong need for control over their environment. And when something threatens that control, their stress response gets activated. Like the stress response I was just talking about a few minutes ago can get really activated. So it is anxiety driven in a lot of ways. But, understanding that PDA profile is actually really important because an individual who is autistic may benefit from certain types of treatments, but an individual who's autistic and PDA wouldn't necessarily benefit from those types of treatments. So low demands, being able to give people as much control over their decisions. So for example, if I have a kiddo in my office who I'm thinking like maybe there's some PDA here, I let them call the shots. I talk to them. I talk to most people. I mean, it's how I talk anyway to my kids. Like we're on the same level, but I really strive to make sure that I'm treating that kiddo with a lot of respect. I give them as much agency as I can. I say, okay, well, we could do this or that, like, or what do you want to do? As much autonomy that you can give them, it goes such a long way.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does this correlate to the classroom? But as you're saying that, that was the teacher that I was, just,
Mhm.
choice. And we even call it like assume the sale, right? You know where you want to go with an end result, but you phrase it as a choice
Mhm.
so that, you have kind of that direction, but giving that student or that kiddo some autonomy so that they feel control. And I feel like that's what a lot of people want in life as it is, right? But I mean,
Yes,
obviously there's
yes.
different levels
There's
of that and need for
there's
it.
there's different, I mean, so there's varying degrees. And of course, avoidance is not specific to PDA. Like we avoid things all the time, just as human beings, right? And someone with anxiety would also engage in avoidance behaviors. It doesn't necessarily mean they have PDA. I mean, there's different kind of check boxes that we're looking for, criterion that we're looking for to call it like a PDA profile. But oftentimes when parents understand that, it's like an aha moment. I mean, just because so much could help this child by just talking to the child differently, which as a mother myself, it's unintuitive a lot of the time. Like I'm gonna give you all as much control. I mean, I have a 7-year-old and giving him that much control. I mean, I try to, but it can be very unintuitive for us. So it takes work, but the results can be astounding. And schools lately, I think, have been learning about this, and I've talked with some schools about this. And we're hoping to actually go out there and educate schools about this because there's a lot that can be done in the classroom, like allowing the student to choose their assignment topic. Like maybe a student just really wants to write about rowing, like let them write about rowing if they can. And things like that at school can go a long way. Because some of these kids who have these profiles, they school avoid because school is just so demanding and can be a lot and can be really taxing for these kids.
Absolutely. How do you then help? And I love that part about going out and educating because I think there's definitely a need for that. And so, how would you best kind of help guide an educator or a parent on some of these choices and best ways to support our students so that they feel like they're supported and they can flourish?
So with kids who have the PDA profile, I refer a lot of families to the website pdanorthamerica.com. PDA North America has an amazing wealth of resources and readings, and there's conferences that they're doing. I mean, it's a really incredible website that has a lot of good stuff out there. My colleague Donna Henderson does talks on PDA, which I know you know her, and she's an excellent speaker. So there's a lot out there, and there's also a support group for parents that I often refer families to who find that really, really supportive and useful. Anxiety, it really depends on the type of anxiety. There's a treatment called SPACE that's really amazing, that's considered evidence-based, which means there's a lot of evidence supporting that it works. And it doesn't treat the child, it helps the parents. So it gives us tools to use with our kids to diminish that anxiety response. And it's all about parenting and how to modify our parenting style so we're not inadvertently reinforcing the maladaptive anxiety responses in our kids. And it's really an incredible treatment.
And parents or folks that are listening can Google space and find more information on it as well. And
Yes,
different
yes.
practices that offer that for families.
Yeah, so if there's space, so the website is spacetreatment.net, and SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And it's really proven to be really effective, like even just as effective, if not more effective than CBT for the child. I mean, it's huge. It's awesome.
That is awesome. And what a great resource.
Yeah.
How can parents recognize anxiety in kiddos? Like, what are the signs and that either parents or teachers should kind of look out for? Kind of also tag onto that. At what age or stage do you typically would start to see symptoms or signs?
So you can see symptoms of anxiety in very young kids. It doesn't necessarily mean it's an anxiety disorder. So there's a difference there. So anxiety is not the bad guy. I mean, anxiety is very normal. And in fact, we need a little anxiety to get stuff done. It's when it becomes too much and we're engaging in behaviors that are not considered super healthy, like avoiding. Like avoidance behaviors can be really problematic, or dysregulated behaviors because our amygdala is so sensitive and when we're going into fight. That's what you want to treat. So it's not so much anxiety is not the bad guy. It's really these other things that become the bad guy. So a little kid, I mean, it's very typical for a little one to have separation anxiety from their parents. But if it's to the point where you can't leave ever, that's kind of a problem, I would think, right? A child who, I keep thinking about the very classic eager to please perfectionistic girl who's just really deliberate and doing as much as they can to get really good grades or to please, this authority figure or that teacher, and kind of ignoring what's happening underneath, because a kid like that has a lot going on and they might not be showing it. So that's the other thing. I mean, some kids have even keeled temperaments, and that might mask the anxiety. It might be more internal, and that can be hard to see.
What is the best way then for a parent to be able to advocate for their kiddo that is masking all day and then just comes home and is a puddle, right? So what are some ways that you have seen effective either for the parent to better communicate with the school and have the school have a better understanding of what really is going on internally?
So, and that is so commonly the case, Wendy, that kids just hold it together. And I know you know this, like hold it together during the day and then they get home and it's just like waterworks, or they just unleash. And that is so common. And these poor schools have no idea. Like, how are they supposed to know? So that's where an evaluation can actually be really useful. So oftentimes we're talking to schools. I know personally, I know a few others a few of my colleagues also do this. I will write sections in our report that are specifically geared for the school, like ways to understand Johnny. It might look like he's, doing great and he's got a smile on his face, but it's taking him enormous effort, to maintain this strong academic record. And at home, it becomes much harder for him. So oftentimes we're explaining that, but I also think that parents, teachers and schools, they want to help your kid too. They want to know. So I think it's important for parents to also communicate, like, hey, you might not be seeing this, but this is what's been happening when Johnny gets home. I mean, he's really struggling, and I'd love to have a conversation with you, figure out what's going on at school, and kind of brainstorm ways where we can help him, because that is often the case that's happening.
So before we get into some ways to help, what can the manifestation look like of symptoms, whether it's behaviorally, emotionally, cognitively?
So in the school setting or just in general?
Probably a little bit of both, like general, out in we think about home, community, and school.
Mhm.
And oftentimes, we see a little bit of we see a little bit of these symptoms or a lot of it, depending on the setting, home, school, or community. So take your pick. How's that?
Yeah, so I think ambiguity can be really difficult for anxious kiddos and anxious people. So, if a kiddo's asking you a lot of questions about like what to expect or what are we doing next, and it seems excessive, there's probably a red flag that maybe there's a little anxiety happening. They tolerating that ambiguity or the unknown can be really threatening and really scary for these kids. So that could be a sign of needing to know about things or needing the plan or needing to know the plan, or when there's a schedule change, having difficulty with that. If someone or if a child is starting to avoid things that they didn't normally avoid, like if they really liked playing soccer, but now they're not going outside to play soccer. I mean, I'd want to know why that's happening. Maybe there's something inducing anxiety there. Maybe there's another kid who's maybe not being super kind, or I don't know. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons why that's happening. But if you're noticing a change in your kid and the child is starting to avoid things, I mean, avoidance is a big sign of anxiety. So if there's avoidance happening, that's a key sign to dig deeper.
Can we talk a little bit about dysregulation and what that can look like and kind of what that term means and how to support that for parents?
So some people have temperaments that are very sensitive. So they're likely born this way, where they just, when they detect threat, they become more what we call dysregulated or more heightened. Their reactions might seem extreme to an outsider. It might seem disproportionate to the situation, like maybe they're flying off the handle over something really minor. And in my opinion, that's almost always related to anxiety, where their amygdala might be overactive, the cortisol is going crazy, and there's just a lot happening in the brain. The prefrontal cortex is not doing a good job calming this down, and it can cause panic-inducing symptoms in somebody. And there are people who are really just there is this biological, neurobiological basis for this, because there are some people who are very temperamentally sensitive, where this is how they respond, and this is how anxiety feels for them. So as an outsider, it might seem quite outlandish that your child is reacting to like such a like it could just be something simple like we're not going to the mall today, and then whoa, like Cindy flew off the handle. But for Cindy, that's how it feels. I mean, that's what's happening inside. So I think as a parent, it can be terrifying to see your child fly off the handle like that, but also remembering that the way that they're responding, that's how she's feeling inside. And it can induce such a panic, it can induce that panic response and feel really, really scary. The more often that happens, this is why treatment is so critical. The more often that happens, the more conditioned your brain gets to acting that way. And the more likely you are to keep being anxious, the more likely you are that the hippocampus, that part of the brain that's responsible for memory, learns that this is unsafe, this is unsafe. And the more likely that you are to experience these things, and it affects your brain development pretty significantly. I mean, anxiety can really affect it.
So in terms of, I just want to step back. You had said threat, but I want to kind of dive into that just for a second, because threat can look very different, right? For
Mhm.
students and for kids, it doesn't have to be that, a big polar bear is chasing me, but it can be, oh, I'm asked to read a passage
It's
and
perceived threat. Yes.
yeah.
Perceived threat.
Yeah. So
Yep.
how does a parent or a teacher help identify what that could be for a child?
So that's a really good question. And I think it depends on the child, because for some children, we can see them reacting. And for some children, we don't. I mean, we might see avoidance. We might see a child shut down. I do see, for instance, some of my autistic kids, and this isn't based on research, this is just anecdotally in my experience, we can see a shutdown occur where they might become non-responsive, might even hide their faces or avoid eye contact, and that's what we call shutdowns, and they're very overwhelmed to the point where their systems aren't functioning and they're not able to engage. So in a moment like that, if you do see something like that, you got to give the kid space. let them recover, let them recoup, and then come back and try to process with them about what was happening. In a situation where a child may seem, again, very reactive, flying off the handle, you also got to give them space because you can't rationalize in that way when someone's in a state like that. Again, that prefrontal cortex is not doing a good job of calming down that amygdala. And you can't reason with someone when they're in a state like that. So giving them space, letting them calm down and engaging whatever self-soothing behaviors they need, and then revisiting and trying to talk about it to give them some tools, some tips.
And that's really important. And I'm glad you had mentioned that. I have seen often that, and just in a educational environment, that when a kid is kind of having a moment, and space is usually the best way to kind of just let them kind of process through all this. I've seen educators will, just best intentions trying to talk to them, and that really always doesn't go well, right? And so what are some tips that you have seen to really help kind of, I think, that education component there of just space makes it easy to say. Not always
Often,
easy to do for people, but
sure. And in like a public setting, like a classroom, it can be really difficult. I feel for these teachers truly because it can be really difficult. And again, this is where communication with the parent or a psychologist or again with testing can be really critical in explaining to the school, like, hey, when Cindy gets really heightened, it's really helpful for her to have a space where she can pace, get her energy out, and then she can come back in and relax. So having that communication, I think, is really critical, and that education about the student and what helps them, because there are different coping skills that can help different people. And some of these traditional coping skills, like deep breathing, may not actually help somebody. It may feel demoralizing, especially for our kids with PDA tendencies, that often pisses them off when you're trying to tell them to engage and giving them another demand. It can just amplify it, which is problematic for obvious reasons.
how do you explain to a parent that comes to you and is asking just about what does testing look like? What would be the benefit of it? Maybe they're fearful of results or so forth. I do, even just when parents call me, want to know in terms of what is the benefit of testing. And then they always ask, private testing versus the public school setting. So I would love to know kind of how you explain this to parents.
It's a good question. I mean, so it really, for me, testing can be so useful in just learning about yourself. So taking diagnoses completely off the table, because diagnosing is actually a very small part of what we do. We're aiming to really understand the person. And if there's a diagnosis that fits that, then cool. And if there isn't, then there isn't. But at Stixrud, we take strength-based approach to all of our work, and it's really more of an emphasis on what the kid's good at and how to capitalize that and how to motivate the child versus pointing out what their flaws are, pointing out what might be more difficult for them. And it's a really, I think it's a balance of this, because we also want to give the child, we want to validate them. A lot of the times the kids know, like, this is hard for me. Like, why is it that I respond this way? Why is it that the social world is so much harder for me than it is for my peers? Why is it hard for me to make and keep a friend? Why can't I be easygoing like other people? So the evaluation has been life-changing, I think, for a lot of people, because they finally might have a word for it, but even above that, they have a greater understanding of themselves, and it can give a lot of good information. So to me, it's an asset. I think it's really awesome to be able to get your kid tested. The biggest downside of testing is the cost.
How does that look like for parents curious about insurance covering it or out of pocket, so forth?
Yeah, so at Stixrud, so Patty Eister, who is, a godsend, and I'm gonna cry endlessly when she finally retires, which I hope is never, but she is like the insurance guru. So she is constantly, making super bills, but also tailoring the super bills specific to the insurance provider. So it makes it even easier for families to get as much as they can reimbursed, because we are a fee for service. And we do require payment. We can do some payment plans and such, but we are out of pocket. Because of that, we try to help families get as much as they can covered, and we're usually successful, but of course it's never a guarantee. It's always a bonus. It's kind of how you have to think about it. With school-based testing, the difference there, because you asked about that, but the difference there is that with school-based testing, it's it's an educational type of testing. So there's not usually like a formal diagnosis made. There's not usually a ton of time put into understanding the person as much. I mean, it's really for educational purposes, as it should be. Does the child need accommodations? Is there a learning issue in this area or that area? What does the IQ look like? So it's answering questions like that. It's not really a clinical process, but at Sticksroot, and I know at other practices, we do comprehensive neuropsychological evaluations. So we're looking at multiple domains. We're looking at IQ, but we're also looking at language and memory and spatial reasoning, reading, writing, math, attention, executive functioning. So we're really diving deep.
And is there anything that sticks out in your mind if a parent comes to you, just because we are talking about anxiety, but we also mentioned ADHD, we mentioned autism. Is there something that sticks out to you that you would say to a parent or professional that says, I would, we're seeking this evaluation, that you would say, please ask for X, Y, and Z testing?
Yes. So we almost always urge people to pursue a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation for their children, because so much of the time we might think that our child, oh, maybe they can't focus, but with ADHD, there's also higher rates of learning disabilities, higher rates of anxiety, much higher rates. I mean, in my experience, it almost always accompanies ADHD. So understanding all of those components, I think, is really important, because what you really want to know is what's going on, but more importantly, how to help. And if you don't have all the information, how are you supposed to move forward in an effective way? So we are almost always recommending the comprehensive evaluation. In some cases, if the child has already had a comprehensive evaluation, but the parent has a question about maybe autism or an LD or something that was missed or overlooked, then we can do, more targeted testing. Or, in the rare cases, which is this almost never happens, but if it's a really straightforward presenting issue, then, we try to be flexible and work with people, and we can do a targeted evaluation. But again, I think that that's kind of shortchanging yourself. Adults, we do all sorts of different things. I mean, adults, we do ADHD testing, social cognition testing. We can do all sorts of things for adults, but for kids, we really try to do our due diligence.
And then I feel like I'm kind of a little bit all over, but I wanted to go back to just the genetic factors for a second that can contribute to the development of anxiety. Or are you born with it? How does kind of that gene and genetic and environment combo look like for kiddos with an anxious profile?
So, I mean, if you have a parent who's got an anxiety disorder, it's, more likely you will too.
Yeah,
But again, right? But, environment plays a big role too. So if you're in a high stressed environment, that's going to amplify it or exacerbate that likelihood. So look, I mean, anxiety affects a lot of people. I mean, I think the World Health Organization, it was like 4% of the world has an anxiety condition. So it's huge. I mean, it affects a lot of people, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, like I keep saying. But if you have this predisposition and you're stressed all the time because of school or socially or whatnot, then that's bad. I mean, that's where the effects can be detrimental and affect brain development. I mean, I don't think people really understand that piece, because it is so impactful that high anxiety is actually correlated with Alzheimer's disease, because the cortisol level, I mean, if there's a lot of cortisol going in your brain, that's going to affect the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is a big part of Alzheimer's. So there's a correlation there that just tells you, that to me tells me how impactful it is to be chronically anxious.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the cortisol. You've mentioned it a couple of times. How is this intertwined with our big, beautiful brains?
So cortisol is a hormone, and it's released with the HPA axis. It's a hormone that's released after our amygdala is activated. And again, if you're sensing threat and it's real threat, and or the prefrontal cortex isn't calming it down, and then the HPA axis and starts to release these hormones, it releases cortisol, and then it floods. And that's where, when you start to feel, that's why we have physiological symptoms of anxiety. So your heart starts to race, and you get different physical symptoms, and that's cortisol affecting you. So if there's cortisol going constantly, then that's not good. It's not good for anybody.
No, not good at all.
Not good.
So before we kind of talk about interventions, is there anything up to this point that I didn't ask that would help us kind of clarify everything before we talked about interventions?
So I think parents' instinct is everything. And if you, as a parent, if you feel like something's different or your child is feeling a certain way, or if you have any concerns, like don't ignore that feeling. I think oftentimes mothers are concerned, and I know I've been a victim of this myself, that are we making too much of this? Is this too, and I mean, I can't tell you how many parents say that, and I've said that myself, like, I don't know if this is normal or, like I can't tell if this is if I'm making too much of this but like the, the but is important. That instinct is we know our kids better than anyone. And if you're having a gut feeling that something's off or your child's experiencing something else or something some mood related issue, then follow that gut reaction, because I can't stress enough, early treatment for anxiety can go such a long way, and it can prevent a lot of other bad things in the future, like depression, which is much harder to treat.
Yeah. Yeah. And I say that often, exactly that, in terms of trust your gut as a parent. Trust your gut, because you may talk to somebody, a professional that kind of says, well, I think it may be this, and your gut is still telling you, I don't think it's this. And then you
Right.
go. And so, really kind of, I think, trusting your gut and keeping kind of this dialogue, whether it's written or just in, inside your thoughts of what are you seeing? What does this mean? How is this playing out? And kind of that thinking ahead until you can get an answer that aligns with what your gut is telling you. I think there's really something powerful about that for a parent.
Agreed.
And even an educator, when I've taught in the classroom, I, will say, I don't, and even now as a professional, I don't know exactly what this is, but this is what it's feeling like to me. This is what it looks like to me. And here are the resources that you can go seek that can give you a better definition. That's not my lane, but this is what I'm sensing, that there's more to what's being presented,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And that is that power of community, and of bringing it back to what you said in terms of like the PDA of North America, or just whatever it may be with anxiety, finding your people and finding your community. So as a caregiver or even as a professional, you don't feel alone in that process or that journey. And you can say, oh, there are people that have gone before me. So you're not feeling like you have to recreate the wheel with this information, I think is incredibly powerful as a parent.
Agreed. And having that community is, I just think, like, I'm not alone. I'm not alone in
Yeah.
this. There are other people who are in the same boat. I mean, that alone can go, so far for validation and sense of normalcy and all sorts of things.
That's right. That's right. So, how can we educate either parents or professionals that are working directly with students, whether again it's anxiety or ADHD or autism, to better support their student or their child in the school day or in the community? What are some things that you have seen that have worked really well as you're writing reports and making recommendations?
So I think the first thing is understanding the function of the behavior and like what's really happening and why is this happening and why is it happening here and not there. And then, we all as humans need validation and understanding and grace. And as much as we can give that to our kids, the better. The other thing that Bill Stixrud emphasizes, which I so agree with, is the importance of parents and providers and educators being a non-anxious presence to children, and how much our kids feed off of us and our presentation and what we're giving off. And the less anxious we are, invariably, the less anxious they may be. I mean, I can't guarantee it, but it may help. It may help them. And coming to our kids without judgments and understanding that while it may seem totally crazy that my kid is flying off the handle because of this really minor schedule change, understanding that that experience that they are demonstrating is very real for them, and that's the perceived threat for them. And what they're showing you is what they're feeling, which can help, I think, parents and providers and educators empathize with the kid, which can then facilitate that rapport building and help the kid move forward. I don't know if I'm answering your question. These are just thoughts I'm having,
I
like
love
kind of
them.
off the
I love all
cuff.
the thoughts, which is important. And then let me ask you, because you brought up just understanding the function of behavior.
Mhm.
Can you just speak real quickly of what that means? Like, what is a functional behavioral assessment, and what does understanding the function of the behavior mean for either an educator or a parent?
So when I say function of the behavior, I mean a child may look like they're anxious, but maybe they're not. Like have maybe they're autistic and maybe their sensory systems are super sensitive and they can't tolerate loud noise. So they don't go to the park or they don't go somewhere that's really loud, which you might think, oh, that's avoidance and that's bad. But maybe for this kid, that's not actually avoidance. Maybe that's what they have to do. And maybe they need an accommodation for that. And maybe at school, they need to be excused from the cafeteria because the cafeteria is really loud and there are a lot of smells and things like that. So when I say function, that's what I mean, because a child with that kind of stuff going on, I wouldn't recommend exposure therapy. Like exposure therapy isn't gonna, it's gonna not gonna do anything. It's probably gonna make the kid really angry at you because it's not fun to begin with. But it's not necessarily anxiety. It's their sensory system and them having to take these, I think, very important accommodations to exit or to avoid that situation. If a child is avoiding the park because of social anxiety, well, then that's different. Then you want to think about some different treatments for that are more maybe exposure based or, and again, I'm not an interventionist, so I'm not sure what there's so many anxiety treatments these days, but treating that anxiety would look very different than treating what you think is anxiety in an autistic kid who's really just sensory sensitive and avoiding situations that heighten it and make them very uncomfortable.
So when a parent gets a report and you have all of your recommendations, what is kind of your little golden nugget that you tell parents to do with all of that? Because you provide a lengthy report,
We
and so
do.
with
Yeah.
which is great. And then so what is your takeaway for parents that you would love for them to know once they get all of these recommendations?
That their child's going to be okay. I mean, that's the number one thing. And all of this, all of the information that we get, and you're right. I mean, I write 28-page reports sometimes, and that's a lot, a lot. And as a mom, I'd be like, oh my God, like this is too much stuff. But I just think that these kids are so amazing. And my strengths section is almost longer than the other stuff. I mean, I just think there's so much you want to say about a child and everybody's different. So the recommendations are almost always different. But I think for a parent, giving them that comprehensive understanding of their child, and also coming up with a plan that makes sense to them and in collaboration with them. That's huge. That's really why, we do feedbacks as a part of the evaluation process before we give reports to parents. Because I mean, I know there are practices who do it differently where they might provide the report before the feedback, but in our minds, like we need the feedback. That's part of this. Like that's actually a big part, and not, if not the most important part of this, because we think the parents are hugely instrumental in thinking about their kid and how to help them move forward and what might make sense for them might not make sense for someone else and what the kid might have buy-in with. So it really depends on that too. For me, what's important is that the parents feel like I understood their child. That's the number one thing, and that I really got them, and that I took it seriously, and we try to treat every kid like they're our own, and that they feel confident that they can move forward with the plan we set in place.
And then what would be your tip for them to then communicate that information to the school as to
So
like what they feel would be the best school supports?
oftentimes, if we're thinking the school needs to make some modifications or we want to go for accommodations, we advise parents to share the report with them if they're comfortable and allowing so the school can see the comprehensive picture because we were saying at the beginning of this podcast, Wendy, like so many times schools have no idea like what's happening at home and they're like, wait a minute, Johnny's, punching the wall. Like I like he doesn't do that here. Like, and I think that that's information that the school should know because they often don't realize what it takes for Johnny to sit still all day and perform. So sharing the report is often advisable, and we are here to help with that. I mean, a lot of times we go to meetings and school meetings and we often talk to teachers too and guidance counselors and such, and we're pretty involved in all that too. As much as the parent wants us to be, of course, but we're here.
What did I not ask or not know enough to ask that I should have asked you?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I think you've asked me some good things. I mean, I guess for me, I just keep thinking about how we have more depression and anxiety now than we ever did. And the pandemic made it way worse, unfortunately, along with other things. And if we can get kids in for treatment, if there's anxiety happening and we can get that treated, it can go such a long way in preventing so many things like depression, self-harm behaviors, and so much more. And I just can't underestimate the importance of early identification and early intervention, really, with this.
And then if I always ask my guests one final question, if you had a billboard with one tip for parents, what would it be and why?
Trust your gut and don't ignore red flags, because we want to ignore them. Again, I'm a mom and I ignore them all the time.
That's a good life lesson.
It is, but I ignore them all the time, but try not to.
Oh, perfect. Perfection. Salya, this has been wonderful. And I really appreciate your time and coming on this show and kind of talking about, we went in a bunch of different directions, but hopefully I know there's some nuggets in here that people are going to take away and they're going to be writing furious notes with all of this information. We will have your contact information in the show notes. People can reach out if they have further questions. So I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for tuning in to the Special Ed Strategist. Remember, the right support can make all the difference. As your dedicated special ed strategist, I'm here to guide, collaborate, and empower your kiddos' success. Keep igniting potential one step at a time. Until next time, take care and keep strategizing. Today's episode is brought to you by Learning Essentials and our Cracking the Code to Special Education eligibility course. Empower your advocacy, erase confusion, and unlock the services your kiddo deserves. Learn more at learningessentialsedu.com.